Imagine waking up one day and discovering that every choice you've made in your life, every relationship you've stayed in too long, every job you've hated but kept, every moment of anxiety you've nursed like a sick pet has been unconsciously designed to keep you in pain. Not because you're broken, not because you're weak, but because somewhere in the deepest recesses of your mind, suffering has become home. Picture this. You're scrolling through social media and you see someone living the life you claim to want. Instead of feeling inspired, you feel that familiar twist in your stomach, a cocktail of envy, self-pity, and bitter resignation. You tell yourself you're just being realistic about your limitations. But what if that's not realism at all? What if that's addiction speaking? Consider the last time you had a genuine opportunity for happiness. Maybe it was a compliment you deflected, a chance at love you sabotaged, or a moment of peace you destroyed with worry about what could go wrong. Did you notice how quickly you found a way to return to familiar discomfort? How effortlessly you transformed potential joy into predictable pain? Here's the paradox that will haunt you. We are the only species that actively seeks out suffering when survival is not at stake. A lion doesn't lie awake at night rehearsing past failures. A bird doesn't sabotage its own nest building because it fears success. Yet, you intelligent, capable, aware, you will choose the familiar ache of loneliness over the uncertain territory of connection. You'll select the known misery of a dead-end job over the potential failure of pursuing your dreams. Why do we do this? Why do we cling to our pain like a security blanket? Why does the prospect of genuine happiness feel more terrifying than the certainty of suffering? There's something profoundly disturbing about the human condition that we rarely dare to examine. We don't just endure suffering, we cultivate it, we feed it, we protect it from anything that might threaten its existence in our lives. We become its loyal servants, its devoted caretakers, its willing prisoners. Think about your own patterns. How many times have you been on the verge of breakthrough, only to find yourself mysteriously self-destructing? How often have you been offered a lifeline, only to discover your hands were too busy holding onto the anchor that was dragging you down? How frequently have you mistaken your cage for shelter, your chains for identity, your wounds for wisdom? The most chilling realization is this: your suffering doesn't just happen to you, you happen to your suffering. You are an active participant in its creation and maintenance. You are, in ways you haven't yet begun to understand, addicted to it. Isn't about masochism or some pathological desire for pain. This is about something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. The way suffering becomes so interwoven with your sense of self that you cannot imagine who you would be without it. The way pain becomes so familiar that peace feels like a foreign language you've never learned to speak. You've been conditioned to believe that happiness is a destination you earn through struggle, that joy is something you deserve only after you've paid sufficient dues in misery. But what if the opposite is true? What if your attachment to suffering is exactly what keeps happiness at arm's length? What if the very thing you think is preparing you for a better life is actually ensuring you'll never have one? The questions that will shatter everything you think you know about yourself are these. What if your depression isn't a chemical imbalance, but a protective mechanism gone wrong? What if your anxiety isn't a disorder, but an addiction to certainty in an uncertain world? What if your relationship with suffering is so intimate, so essential to your identity, that you would rather be miserable than risk the terrifying possibility of becoming someone you don't recognize? There's a war being fought inside your mind, and suffering is winning. Not because it's stronger than joy, but because it's had more practice. It knows your weaknesses, your triggers, your deepest fears. It has convinced you that it's your friend, your teacher, your only reliable companion in a world that might abandon you. But what if everything you've been told about suffering by society, by your own mind, by the very voice reading these words is a lie designed to keep you trapped? What if the prison you've been living in doesn't just have an open door? What if there never was a door at all? The answer lies buried in the architecture of your mind, in patterns carved so deep they feel like destiny rather than choice. Carl Jung understood this when he wrote about the shadow, that part of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, the darkness we'd rather project onto others than face within ourselves. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. We don't just have a shadow, we become addicted to it. Your suffering addiction didn't begin with your first heartbreak or your first failure. It began the moment you learned that pain was predictable, that misery was controllable, that being hurt was safer than being vulnerable to hope. As a child, you discovered that crying brought attention, that being sick meant being cared for, that struggle earned sympathy. Without realizing it, you began to associate suffering with love, pain with significance, wounds with worth. Friedrich Nietzsche called this the slave morality, the perverse way we've learned to find meaning through victimhood, to derive identity from our damage. He saw how Christianity had taught us to glorify suffering, to find nobility in pain, to believe that the meek shall inherit the earth. But Nietzsche missed the deeper truth. We don't just glorify suffering because society tells us to. We glorify it because it gives us something to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain. Don't think about your own relationship with pain. When was the last time you felt truly proud of yourself? Not for overcoming some obstacle, not for surviving some tragedy, but simply for existing in joy. Can you even remember what that feels like? Most people can't, because most people have never learned to derive identity from anything other than their struggles. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this fundamental human predicament better than almost anyone. He recognized that human beings are condemned to oscillate between the pain of want and the pain of boredom, are quite satisfied, never quite at peace. But Schopenhauer saw only half the picture. He thought this was our fate. He didn't realize it was our choice. The neurological reality is even more disturbing. Your brain is designed to create patterns, to find familiarity, to seek homeostasis. When suffering becomes your baseline, your nervous system will actually resist happiness because it registers as a threat to your established identity. This isn't metaphorical, it's measurable. Your brain literally becomes addicted to the neurochemical cocktail of stress, anxiety, and depression because these states have become synonymous with normal. Dr. Gabor Mate, in his work on addiction, reveals how trauma doesn't just damage us, it teaches us to damage ourselves. The child who learns that chaos is normal will create chaos as an adult. The teenager who discovers that drama gets attention will manufacture drama for the rest of their life. The adult who equates struggle with authenticity will unconsciously sabotage any situation that feels too good to be true. But here's the most insidious part. Your addiction to suffering masquerades as wisdom. You tell yourself you're being realistic when you expect the worst. You call it protecting yourself when you refuse to hope. You label it learning from experience when you let past pain dictate future possibilities. You've convinced yourself that your pessimism is intelligence, your cynicism is sophistication, your resignation is maturity. Jean-Paul Sartre understood that we are condemned to be free, but he didn't fully grasp how desperately we fight against that freedom. We choose our chains because chains are familiar. We select our suffering because suffering is predictable. We embrace our limitations because limitations require no courage, no risk, no possibility of failure. The existentialists spoke of bad faith, the way we deny our freedom to choose by pretending we have no choice. But suffering addiction goes deeper than bad faith. It's the way we actively choose unfreedom because freedom feels too dangerous, too vast, too full of possibility for someone who has learned to find safety in struggle. Consider how you talk about your problems. Notice the pride in your voice when you describe how hard your life is, how much you've endured, how many obstacles you've overcome. This isn't humility, it's identity. You're not just describing your circumstances, you're defending your sense of self. Without your suffering, who would you be? The most terrifying question isn't whether you can overcome your problems, it's whether you want to. Because overcoming them would mean losing the very thing that makes you feel special, significant, worthy of attention and care. It would mean stepping into a version of yourself that you've never met, a version that doesn't need pain to feel real, struggle to feel valuable, or wounds to feel worthy of love. This is why self-help fails. This is why therapy can go in circles for years. This is why you can know exactly what you need to do to feel better and still not do it, because feeling better isn't the goal. Maintaining your familiar relationship with suffering is the goal. Everything else is just elaborate. Self-deception. Your suffering addiction has become so sophisticated that it can even use healing as a form of suffering. You become addicted to the process of being broken, to the identity of being someone who is working on themselves, to the drama of breakthrough and relapse. You turn recovery into just another form of struggle, growth into another type of pain. The uncomfortable truth is that you're not suffering despite your best efforts to heal. You're suffering because of them, because healing, for you, has become just another way to avoid the one thing that terrifies you more than pain, the possibility of genuine peace. The ripple effects of your suffering addiction extend far beyond your own inner world, creating a silent epidemic that shapes every relationship, every decision, every moment of potential joy in ways so subtle you mistake them for reality itself. You've become an unwitting architect of a life designed to confirm your deepest fears, validate your darkest assumptions, and ensure that hope remains forever just out of reach. Watch how you move through the world. Notice how you unconsciously seek out people who will hurt you in familiar ways, not because you enjoy pain, but because their particular brand of damage fits perfectly with your existing wounds. You're drawn to the emotionally unavailable because their rejection feels like home. You're attracted to the critical because their judgment echoes the voice in your head. You gravitate toward the chaotic because their instability matches your internal landscape. This isn't coincidence. This is your suffering addiction in action, curating experiences that feed your need for familiar pain while disguising itself as bad luck, poor timing, or simply how life is. You've become a magnet for situations that confirm your belief that happiness is temporary, that good things don't last, that you're fundamentally unworthy of sustained joy. But the most devastating consequence isn't what you attract, it's what you repel. Healthy people feel your addiction to suffering like a low-frequency hum, an energy that makes them uncomfortable without knowing why. They offer you genuine care, and you find ways to make it feel insufficient. They present you with opportunities for growth, and you discover reasons why they won't work. They extend authentic love, and you test it until it breaks or transforms into something that feels more like the conditional approval you're used to. Your nervous system has become so calibrated to chaos that peace registers as danger. When life gets too good, when relationships become too stable, when success comes too easily, your internal alarm system screams that something is wrong. You begin to scan for problems, manufacture conflicts, or sabotage situations, not because you want to suffer, but because suffering is the only state in which you feel truly alive, truly yourself, truly real. That this creates what psychologists call hedonic adaptation, but in reverse. Instead of becoming accustomed to pleasure, you've become addicted to pain. Your baseline for normal requires a certain level of stress, anxiety, or emotional turmoil. When that level drops below your accustomed threshold, you unconsciously create situations to bring it back up. You pick fights with people you love. You procrastinate on projects that matter. You worry about problems that don't exist yet. The cognitive biases that once protected you from genuine threats now protect you from genuine happiness. Your confirmation bias filters out evidence that contradicts your belief in your own unworthiness. Your negativity bias amplifies every criticism while diminishing every compliment. Your catastrophic thinking prepares you for disasters that never come while blinding you to opportunities that do. Consider how you process compliments. Someone tells you you're talented, and your mind immediately begins cataloging reasons why they're wrong, why they don't really know you, why they're just being polite. Someone expresses genuine affection, and you start planning for when they'll inevitably leave. Someone offers you a chance to succeed, and you focus on all the ways you might fail. Your addiction to suffering has trained you to be a master of mental aikido, deflecting every good thing that comes your way. You've created what researchers call a self-fulfilling prophecy on a massive scale. Your expectation of rejection makes you act in ways that invite rejection. Your belief in your own inadequacy makes you perform inadequately. Your certainty that good things don't last makes you behave in ways that ensure they don't. You're not just predicting your future, you're creating it through the lens of your suffering addiction. The most insidious part is how your addiction colonizes your very perception of reality. You can't imagine that the happy people you see might actually be happy. You assume they're hiding something, faking it, or simply haven't been hit by life's inevitable cruelties yet. You can't conceive that success might be sustainable, that love might be unconditional, that peace might be possible, because these concepts exist outside the framework of your suffering-centered worldview. This perceptual distortion extends to how you interpret your own experiences. A moment of genuine joy becomes too good to be true. A period of calm becomes the calm before the storm. A healthy relationship becomes waiting for the other shoe to drop. You've become so skilled at finding the potential for suffering in every situation that you miss the actual potential for happiness that exists in the same moment. Your addiction even shapes your ambitions. You set goals that are either impossible to achieve, ensuring the familiar pain of failure, or so far beneath your capabilities that achieving them feels meaningless. You avoid pursuing dreams that might actually fulfill you because fulfillment would threaten your identity as someone who struggles. someone who suffers, someone who is perpetually reaching for something just out of grasp. The collective cost of this individual suffering addiction is a society that normalizes misery, celebrates struggle, and treats happiness with suspicion. We've created cultural narratives that glorify the tortured artist, the struggling entrepreneur, the martyr mother, the workaholic father. We've built economic systems that require constant anxiety to function. We've constructed social media, platforms that profit from our insecurity and feed our addiction to comparison and inadequacy. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is the way your suffering addiction robs you of the very thing it pretends to protect, your authentic self. In your effort to avoid the pain of rejection, you've rejected yourself. In your attempt to prevent abandonment, you've abandoned your own needs. In your fear of being hurt, you've hurt yourself more profoundly than anyone else ever could. The rebellion begins not with fighting your suffering, but with recognizing it as the imposter it has always been. The voice in your head that insists you're not enough, that catastrophizes every possibility, that finds danger in every opportunity, isn't your authentic self speaking. It's the addiction. And like any addiction, it will fight viciously to maintain control the moment you threaten its existence. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered something revolutionary. Suffering is not optional, but your relationship to suffering is entirely your choice. He watched as some prisoners broke under conditions that would destroy most people, while others found meaning, purpose, and even moments of transcendence in the same hellish circumstances. The difference wasn't in their external situation, it was in their internal decision about what their suffering would mean. But here's the radical shift that changes everything. You must stop trying to eliminate your suffering and start questioning why you need it. The moment you ask, what would I be without this pain, rather than how do I get rid of this pain, you begin to see the addiction for what it truly is, not a burden you carry, but a choice you make. Consider the most counterintuitive truth of all: your suffering addiction is maintained by your attempts to escape it. Every time you fight your anxiety, you feed it. Every time you resist your depression, you strengthen it. Every time you try to think your way out of emotional pain, you dig yourself deeper into it. The addiction survives on your belief that it's something to be overcome rather than something to be seen through. The ancient Stoics understood this principle. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But they missed the deeper insight. You don't have power over your mind because you can control your thoughts. You have power over your mind because you can choose which thoughts to identify with. Watch your thoughts as if they were weather patterns, interesting, temporary, but not definitively you. When the voice tells you you're not good enough, respond with curiosity rather than belief. Interesting, the addiction is trying to maintain itself again. When anxiety projects future catastrophes, observe it like a scientist studying a predictable phenomenon. Here's that familiar pattern of the addiction trying to keep me in survival mode. This isn't positive thinking, it's conscious rebellion. You're not trying to replace negative thoughts with positive ones. You're recognizing that your thoughts are not you, your emotions are not you, your suffering is not you. You are the awareness that observes all of these things. And that awareness has never been damaged, never been broken, never been addicted to anything. The most powerful question you can ask yourself is not how do I feel better, but who would I be if I didn't need this pain to feel like myself? This question is terrifying because it implies the possibility of a version of you that exists beyond your wounds, beyond your story, beyond your carefully constructed identity. As someone who struggles, start with small acts of rebellion. Notice when you're about to deflect a compliment and don't. Observe when you're about to create drama in a peaceful relationship and choose stillness instead. Catch yourself scanning for problems in a good situation and deliberately focus on what's working. These aren't just behavioral changes. They're acts of war against the addiction that has colonized your mind. But the deepest rebellion is learning to tolerate joy without immediately searching for what's wrong with it. Happiness terrifies your addiction because happiness makes it irrelevant. Every moment you allow yourself to feel genuinely good without waiting for the other shoe to drop, you're proving that you can exist without suffering as your primary identity. Path forward isn't about healing your wounds, it's about recognizing that your wounds were never you to begin with. The shame you've carried, the fear you've nursed, the pain you've protected, these are not permanent features of your psyche. They're temporary visitors that stayed too long because you mistook them for permanent residents. This is where the real work begins, not in trying to become someone different, but in remembering who you were before you learned to suffer. Version of you still exists, not as a memory from the past, but as a possibility in the present. Every child is born with an innate capacity for joy, wonder, and unconditional self-love. This capacity doesn't disappear, gets buried under layers of conditioning, but it remains intact, waiting to be reclaimed. The rebellion against suffering addiction requires you to become ruthlessly honest about the ways you've been participating in your own misery, not to judge yourself, but to see clearly. When you can look at your patterns without the story that justifies them, without the identity that depends on them, without the addiction that defends them, you begin to see how much choice you actually have. The most profound realization is this: you don't need to earn the right to be happy. You don't need to suffer enough to deserve joy. You don't need to prove your worth through pain. Happiness isn't a reward for good behavior, it's your natural state, temporarily obscured by the addiction that convinced you suffering was safer. The rebellion isn't about fighting your way to freedom, it's about recognizing that the prison was always an illusion, the chains were always unlocked, and the guard keeping you trapped was always just a frightened part of yourself that forgot it had the key. Freedom isn't something you achieve, it's something you remember, and the remembering begins the moment you stop feeding the addiction and start starving it of the attention it needs to survive. The ultimate truth that will shatter everything you thought you knew about yourself is this: you were never addicted to suffering at all. You were addicted to the feeling of being someone anyone in a universe that seemed determined to prove you didn't matter. Suffering became your proof of existence, your evidence of significance, your guarantee that you were real enough to feel pain, therefore real enough to be . This revelation changes everything because it reveals that your suffering addiction was never about suffering, it was about identity. It was never about pain, it was about purpose. It was never about misery, it was about meaning. You chose suffering not because you enjoyed it, but because it was the only way you knew how to feel substantial in a world that made you feel invisible. But here's the paradox that completes the circle. The very thing you used to prove your existence was the thing preventing you from actually living. The identity you built from your wounds became a fortress that protected you from further harm while simultaneously imprisoning you from any possibility of genuine aliveness. You became so committed to being someone who suffers that you forgot you had the option to simply be. The deepest truth is that beneath your addiction to suffering lies your addiction to being special. Not special in a grandiose way, but special in the most fundamental way possible. Special enough to deserve attention, care, consideration, love. Your suffering made you unique in a world full of people pretending to be fine. Your pain gave you depth in a culture obsessed with surface. Your wounds made you interesting in a society that rewards those who stand out. This is why healing feels like death. Because in some way, it is. It's the death of the identity that has defined you, the story that has sustained you, the specialness that has set you apart. To heal completely would mean to become ordinary, and ordinary feels like disappearing entirely. Better to remain special through suffering than to risk becoming invisible through joy. But what if I told you that the specialness you've been seeking through suffering has been available through aliveness all along? What if the depth you've found in your wounds pales in comparison to the depth available in your wholeness? What if the meaning you've derived from your pain is nothing compared to the meaning that emerges when you stop needing pain to feel meaningful? The ultimate realization is that your authentic self, the one beneath the suffering, beneath the stories, beneath the addiction to being broken, is infinitely more interesting, more unique, more worthy of love than any identity you could construct from your damage. But you can't know this intellectually. You can only discover it by being willing to let go of everything you think makes you you. This is the final paradox. You must be willing to lose yourself to find yourself. You must be willing to become nobody to discover who you really are. You must be willing to release your grip on the familiar pain that has been your companion for so long that you can't remember what you were like before it moved in. The moment you truly let go, not trying to let go, not thinking about letting go, but actually releasing your death grip on suffering as identity, something extraordinary happens. You discover that joy isn't the opposite of suffering. Peace isn't the absence of pain. Love isn't the reward for healing. These aren't states you achieve after you fix yourself. They're what you are when you stop pretending to be broken. You realize that happiness was never something you had to earn, deserve, or work toward. It was what remained when you stopped working so hard to maintain your suffering. Joy was never a destination you had to reach. It was the ground you were standing on all along, obscured by the elaborate stage set of drama you built on top of it. The most profound shift happens when you understand that you don't need to become someone new to be happy. You need to stop being someone false to remember who you really are. Underneath every layer of conditioning, beneath every wound you've identified with, beyond every story you've told about why you can't be truly free, there exists an unbroken wholeness that has been waiting patiently for you to stop running from it. This wholeness isn't fragile. It can't be damaged by experience, diminished by trauma, or destroyed by time. It's not something you lost and need to recover. It's not something you broke and need to fix. It's what you are, and it's what you've always been, even in your darkest moments of suffering addiction. The ultimate truth is that suffering was never your enemy. It was your misguided friend, trying to help you feel real in the only way it knew how. But now you can thank it for its service and gently show it the door. You can acknowledge the ways it protected you while recognizing that you no longer need protection from life. You need participation in it, and so the circle completes itself. You begin by thinking you need to escape suffering, only to discover you're addicted to it. You realize you're addicted to it, only to discover you're addicted to the identity it provides. You recognize the identity as false, only to discover that letting it go reveals what was real all along. You are not your suffering, you never were. You are the awareness in which suffering appears and disappears, the space in which all experiences arise and pass away, the unchanging presence that remains no matter what stories your mind tells about who you think you are. Welcome home to yourself, the real you, the one who was never broken, never lost, never in need of fixing, the one who has been patiently waiting for you to stop believing in your own impossibility and start living your own truth. The addiction is over. The real life begins now.